let me make it clear here. It's an intimate crowd. And I know that some people have this habit of saying you should save your questions to the end. I'm not that guy. If you have a thought or you have some pushback or just jump in, because I think that makes it a little more interesting for everybody here. And if I don't know, I'm just going to say I don't know, right? Because there are a lot of things I don't know. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about, actually, before we talk about the aftermath, we're going to talk about the pre-math. I'm going to talk about some big things in the environment that shape the American midterm elections and now all of our elections. And then we're going to talk about some things specific to these elections that I think might not have been emphasized and might, in fact, have been unremarked on in the journalistic coverage. And then we can talk about the aftermath. And actually, before we do those three things, I want to test you on a few numbers, okay? These numbers are a month old, but these were the numbers people were using in the run-up to the election. So does that number look familiar? Mm-hmm. It does. Yeah. So that was the average price of a gallon of gasoline in late October, early November. Of course, that jumps around. So, okay, you're doing very well. And what was that number? Oh, so we got an audience full of ringers here, right? Yeah, so that was the inflation, the annualized inflation rate at the time. That's come down a bit, right, Jerry? Okay. That one's tougher, 80% there. Want to trick? That's actually a poll number. 80% of the population said that this was the most important thing on their minds. No, but that was a close second. No. Close. We're getting warm here. The economy, right?
Election?
No, the economy. The economy. People were saying the economy is the number one issue, right? Now, here is another number people weren't talking about and journalists weren't mentioning, and a lot of people who were campaigning didn't bother with either. Yes. Wow. Boy, that's a smart group here. Okay, yes, that's the unemployment rate. And let's turn to our resident economist, Jerry, and say, as far as that number goes, historically, do we consider that a good number or a bad number?
Depends on who you are. If you're unemployed, it's a bad number.
Right. But generally speaking, right, the macroeconomists say, boy, that's a great number, right?
Wall Street says that's not a good number.
Well, I listen to Bloomberg every day. They can't make up their minds what's good or bad, right? But now this is a tough number too, and also unremarked on, I think, frequently, but important, right? This is a big number, because that is GDP growth, right? So the fact is, the economy was not in a recession, even though every time I heard a report about the economy a month ago, we seemed to be already in a recession. This is a very important price, much more important than the other price we looked at. Does it look familiar? You see it all the time, but you probably don't think about it. No, but you know what? I've given this talk a couple times, and that's usually the first guess. I don't buy milk, so it wouldn't. But I'm saying, you drive down the street, you see this all the time. You just see right past it.
This is the highest gas price?
Close. This is the price of diesel. So now you notice that's a lot higher than the price of a gallon of gasoline. And why is that important? Why is that important? Because everything you buy got there with diesel. And so you think about it, 90% of goods in the world move over water. Most of those ships are driven by diesel fuel. When they get on land, they may be transported by trains, which are driven by diesel fuel. Or they're distributed on semis, trucks, which are driven by diesel fuel, right? So that is a number that just pulses through the logistical supply system.
Yeah.
Prim.
Could I ask you, when you say the difference between the two, 385
Yeah.
versus the 650?
Yeah. Yeah.
So 385 is positive because it's from high to down. But this is 615. Do you mean it's from down to high or from high to down? And from how much is the difference? You know, the gasoline dropped, let's say, 20%, and the diesel dropped less than 20% or more
Yes.
than 20%.
Yeah, actually, that's true. So the price of diesel is not only much higher than gas, but it's been recently less elastic than the price of gas. And that is because, for a variety of reasons, the refineries that produce diesel are maxed out.
Oh.
There are some, there's a big refinery in the Midwest that has not been operating for a number of months. There are several refineries in California which have shut down because of the wildfires.
Oh.
The refineries on the East Coast are operating at 100% capacity. And so they just can't produce more diesel to bring to the market. There's a bottleneck there. Right. So that's a very good point too. So diesel and heating fuel are essentially the same product, right? And so the people who make, there might be a slight difference, but it's more or less the same market. And you have a huge demand for heating oil in the Northeast, in New England. Yeah, yeah. I don't know about a few years ago, but certainly a few decades. Yeah, yeah, for a long time. Yeah. Yeah, I remember those days when people bought diesel automobiles because they were going to save on gas, right? That would be a very bad move now, right?
Also a big scam with Volkswagen in Europe, claiming that diesel engines were a lot better for the environment. It turns out they really weren't.
Right, and it also turned out Volkswagen was fiddling with their numbers, right? All right, now here's another important number, not often remarked on in the run-up to the elections, and this is why there's a difference between political scientists and journalists. 37 out of 40. You'll never get this, so I'm going to just jump in here and tell you. In the last 40 midterm elections, 37 times, the out party, the party that did not control the presidency, gained seats. The in party, or the party that controlled the presidency, lost seats. So the fact that you get to a midterm election and the president's party loses seats is simply historically unremarkable, right? The fact, in an historical sense, the fact that the Republican Party, the out party to the presidency, took control of the House of Representatives is completely unremarkable. Yes, sir.
But the 37, how do you define it? To both houses or just the one of them?
Just the House of Representatives. Right.
Okay.
Because the House of Representatives is the more sensitive measure in the sense that all 435 seats are up for grabs. Well, technically, we're going to dispel that myth too, but only 1/3 of the Senate seats are up.
Yeah. So ignore the Senate. So after this midterm election, should be 38 versus 41.
No, I already updated that.
Oh.
Yeah, yeah. I knew you were going to say that, Prim. So I just altered the number for you. Okay, so let me tell you, point to something that's a big deal in the background of all this. And three things that are in the background of all this, I think, that are essential to understand about American elections. And I wouldn't be talking about this, for example, if I were in Japan or Brazil. It's very important that in the United States, the media environment is dramatically different than the media environment in which I grew up, in which you grew up under, right? When you grew up, well, I don't know where you grew up. So let's just talk about where I grew up, right? We turned on the TV, there were basically 3 channels, right? That was it. So you sat down, you made an appointment with the news show, you watched the news at whatever time the news was presented to you, right? You didn't just have a whim to turn on the news and then watch the news, right? You had to wait till they were ready to present it to you, right? But that went away, and a number of things went away. One of them was what we call the Fairness Act. So back in the day when we had those 3 major networks, they were required by FCC regulations to give equal time to candidates. You could not have a Sean Hannity with a parade of Republican favorites with no alternative. You could not have Rachel Maddow with a parade of Democratic candidates and no opposition, right? You had to have equal time. And so that in 1988, that act was repealed. At the same time, can we have the next one? There we go. At the same time, something else emerged, and that was the cable networks, right? 1988, cable had already gotten started. It was spreading, but what cable changed was your appointment viewing for news, right? You had the Fox News model jump out of the box first with 24-hour news, right? Now you can sit down anytime and watch the news. That's different. And of course, they're not the only cable news network, right? There's several. And apparently they're still proliferating. And that makes the news environment very different, of course, because as in any market, you want to get your base audience. When there were 3 channels, people were all competing more or less for the middle rather than segmenting. With the advent of cable, with theoretically an infinite number of channels, people began segmenting news, right? Becoming specialists, if not in one topic, certainly in one demographic or another, right? And that was followed by something else, the Internet of Things, right? So on the Internet now, anybody can find anybody else. And that's very important. The way I like to present this story is when I was a little kid, my father would go and minister to somebody in his church every once in a while, and I was often brought along on these little house visits. And we went to visit once in a while what I considered an old man who had 2 interesting characteristics. And one was that he had a back room in his house, floor to ceiling volumes of stamps. He was just a super philatelist. He had stamps from everywhere in the world, and he would take one of these volumes down while he was talking with my dad, and then he would let me look through these volumes of stamps from around the world. That was great. But the other thing he had, and he always handed to my dad on the way out, was a letter, or a newsletter from the John Birch Society. Do you remember the John Birch Society? This was an ultra right-wing organization. There were communists everywhere. There were secret communists. Jimmy Carter was if you weren't a communist, you were a dupe of the communists, right? But this guy, right, to communicate with like-minded people, basically came down to having this monthly newsletter, right? Where you would get your sustenance and you would see what people were thinking in your like mind, and then maybe you would hand it to somebody like my father to try and cultivate him into your views. But now you don't have to do any of that, right? Now you just turn on your machine, you do a little Google search, you will find people just like you. Whatever your predilection is, you will find it, and you will be in touch with those people who have those similar views. That provides a certain catalyst for people, for thought and action, right? On a much, much grander scale than a monthly newsletter could ever provide. And so in this slide, right, what we're seeing is a fairly simple represent. There's a lot of dots there, but you're really looking at a representation of how Democrats and Republicans get their news from different sources, right? So you have followers of two major parties now who are actually looking at news sources that are different from the news sources their counterparts look at in the other party, right? Now, if you look at this, list on the left here, what's interesting about that is to say to yourself, how many of those sources of news were even available, let's say in 1980, before cable began to be a thing, right? So when I was growing up, we had broadcast TV news. Cable news came later. We hadn't even imagined all the sources of news people could get from social media, right? And to me, it seems absurd, but people do get their news. Lots of people, millions of people, tens of millions of people get their news from social media sites. News, true or false, that's being posted by their friends or by people they think are their friends or they wish were their friends, right? We, of course, had national newspapers. We had the New York Times. We even had USA Today and local newspapers, but we didn't have YouTube. Now, I don't know if you're aware, but you can go on YouTube and there are thousands and thousands of self-made broadcasters on YouTube. You can find people who sit in their own made-up newsroom and talk into a camera as if they were pros. They're in a suit, they've got charts, they're well prepared, and they bring you the news that they want to bring you in the way that they want to bring it to you, and they find an audience, right? Podcasts, and of course, tens of millions of websites that specialize in whatever fetish, political fetish you might have, right? So the news space has exploded outward and fragmented at the same time. And that's the environment in which we now conduct campaigns.
Can you say a little more on the two bottom ones? In a way, I'm surprised they're as low as they do the website for conservative.
Right, because most people are still fairly passive, right? The only barrier to a website is you do have to go look for it. Your TV, you just turn on and it comes at you, right? And here's another one worth looking at. This is not Democrats and Republicans. This is by age, right? Segmenting people by age. And so you can see not only is there this party difference, but there's a very significant difference in where people get their news depending on how old they are, right? I'm sure you have the same experience. Your kids know more than my kids sit down and watch TV at all. My daughter doesn't have cable. My son doesn't have cable. If they want news, they search it out. So now my kids are great, so they have a subscription to national newspaper. But you know, people troll for all kinds of news sources, and they're not necessarily national newspapers.
I probably Peter that you a long time ago, but about 10 years ago, we used to have newspapers for free every day.
Yeah.
New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Star Ledger, just out there, but nobody took them.
Nobody took them. That's right.
They just got thrown out at the end of the day.
Yep. Yep. And in fact, when I was campus provost, I cut those subscriptions off.
Yeah.
And the reason I did it is for that, because the kids didn't read them. They were reading off of their phones and their laptops. They didn't know what to do with a piece of newspaper. And worse, they blew all around the dorms and caused all kinds of litter problems inside and out. So we got rid of that. Now here's a new topic and a new piece of the environment. Here's a number, 16.7 billion dollars. Want to guess what that represents? That's an estimate of how much we just spent on the midterm elections. Terms. In the last 2 decades, it's an exponential increase that we've been witnessing. And there's no reason to think that it's not going to continue to be increasing at an exponential rate.
Is there an estimate on how much they spend for each vote?
Well, we can do the math. Now, if you divide, for example,
I don't know how many million people voted, but
if you divide, now, of this figure, 10 billion, maybe a little more than 10 billion was spent on the federal elections, Congress, Senate. The rest was spent on governorships, legislative races, judicial races, all kinds of local races. But if you take that $10 billion figure and you divide it by the number of seats that flipped in the House, the answer is about 384 million. So you could say we just spent $384 million per each of 26 House seats to change hands.
I just recall hearing that spent $40 million Democratic candidates, and George Soros spent $100 million. That's a far cry from $18 billion. Where do we put some money from?
We're going to get to that. That's right. That's a lot of money. That's got to come from somebody. Where's it come? But there are a lot of people putting tens of millions into the elections. A lot. Yeah, I mean, George Soros is a favorite target, right? But there's a lot of people out there. Yep. And there are a lot of political action committees, and we're going to talk a little bit about dark money. Now, why does that happen? In part because of this. Does those numbers ring a bell? Because it's very important to put that 16.7 billion has to be in the context of what's on the screen now.
That's an indication of how low it was in 2010.
So in 2010, there was a court decision. Whoops. Why is that court decision not coming up? It will. Okay. So there was a court decision called Citizens United. The United States Supreme Court decided a case that was roughly about whether or not the people who made a movie, a documentary called Hillary, the movie, were spending money on an election or simply exercising their right to free speech. Right? So they had, this was a group who made a very unflattering presentation about Hillary Clinton. Unflattering is maybe an understatement. And of course, they were anticipating that Hillary Clinton would be a future presidential nominee, and they were ramping up to fight against her chances of winning. That wound up eventually in front of the Supreme Court. The court ruled in favor of the defendants to say they're exercising their free speech. And while they were at it, the court basically undid the McCain-Feingold constraints on campaign donations and spending, recognizing corporations as people who could exercise their free speech as well, and essentially, like individuals, any individuals you name, spend as much as they wanted to say what they wanted, as long as They were not directly coordinating with a campaign or directly contributing to a campaign. So here on this slide, what we see is three very hot Senate races that just took place in these midterms. And what we're trying to represent here is the amount of money spent by the campaign compared to the amount of money spent by non-campaign organizations. So the candidate has his or her own campaign organization. The candidate's organization comes under the Federal Elections Commission's rules. The candidate has to follow those rules both for donors and for reporting. But if you are not part of the campaign organization, and if you are not coordinating directly with the campaign, you can spend as much money as you want. In other words, you can give your $40 million to a third party. The third party, a political action committee of some kind, doesn't have to report who you are or how much money you gave. And the political action committee can spend all the money you give them on behalf of a candidate, so long as they don't coordinate with the campaign. So what we see here, for example, in Pennsylvania, right? You see that outside groups, this is probably actually a lot more money because all the reporting hasn't completely finished yet. Outside groups spent $100 million, right? Compared to the Senate race, where the Republican campaign organization for Amendment Oz spent $44 million, right? So they spent more than twice as much as the candidate's campaign itself, right? Same is true in Georgia, right? And similarly in Arizona, right? That's a lot of money coming from sources which we cannot identify. Now,
why can't we identify them? Say like a person like Peter Thiel has a lot of money. He gave, like, everyone know that he gave a whole bunch of money to somewhere.
Yeah, because they're not required to report it. They're not required to report it. Now, that raises an interesting problem, because if you're not required to report it, it's difficult to enforce. So here is a little known loophole. Not only does my political action committee not have to report that Prim is giving me $40 million, I don't have to out him, but even though I am forbidden to take money, let's say, from Mr. Putin or Mr. Putin's friends, if I do, chances are small that anybody will find out. Because that's how unenforceable the rule is.
You don't have to report that he gave money, but do you ever have to report that you received money?
I have to report that I received money, yes. But I don't have to say, I don't have to show my sources. Now, I'm forbidden to take money from non-citizens. The question is, will anybody find out if I do? All right, so we have these three things, and we have this media explosion and fragmentation. We have the Citizens United decision, which opens the floodgates for all kinds of third-party money. And one of the consequences of that, both of those things, is that we have the nationalization of elections. Nationalization of elections in the sense that every campaign now is being sourced from around the country, right? You, as a candidate, there are two things you need to be successful, or at least one of two things. One of them is you need to have name recognition. Helps a lot. If you don't have name recognition, you need to be able to raise money. You don't have to have the money yourself necessarily. You need to be able to raise it. And when we say raise it, it doesn't mean from your prospective constituents. It means from anywhere in the country, right? So now candidates are in effect crisscrossing the country, getting their money from everywhere else in the country other than their own constituency, at the same time that news coverage of these elections has become magnified to a huge degree. Do you remember a guy named Eric Cantor?
Mhm.
Yeah, okay. So Eric Cantor was the number 3 guy in the Republican Party.
Florida?
Virginia. He had a rural district in Virginia. Number 3 guy in the Republican Party had a safe district. Where is he now? Yeah, because he lost. He lost a primary election. Out of nowhere, he lost a primary election to a guy who had never run for office before, who had no public experience, had no name recognition, but he did have this. He had on his side, through no doing of his own, 2 national syndicated conservative radio shows that dragged him out week by week and excoriated him for not being fiscally conservative enough. Now, Eric Cantor's whole career was built on being a conservative. So here he is, week by week, in a national audience of tens of millions, being criticized for not being critical enough. And those 2 radio syndicates not only talked against him, but urged voters to vote for his primary opponent. And that primary opponent won. And that's why I say it's the nationalization of elections. Eric Cantor won because his constituents in a rural Virginia district were told by radio people in California and New York not to vote for him. I think nobody was shocked more than Cantor's colleagues. I mean, he was obviously something of a consensus builder, which you have to be to get up in the party organization. Like I said, he was number 3. All right, so here's a new number to look at. Here's we'll look at some things that are important to this 2022 election. 25% is the number of people in New Jersey who we estimate cast their ballots by mail. So, of course,
Voted at all.
what percent voted at all in New Jersey? Why do you ask that question?
I've heard it said that such a low percentage of people voted that if a larger percentage of the party came out and voted, either party would have won. But I've heard 38% of the Republicans voted in New Jersey. It's true or not?
Well, let's come back to that because turnout is on one side is crucial, of course, to either candidate's success in an election. And on the other hand, rationally, for many voters, turning out to vote makes no sense. Right? But we'll come back to that conundrum. Okay, so here's a trend line. What we're trying to show here is the percentage of people who vote on election day, the percentage of people who vote before election day in person.
When you say people, do you mean registered voters?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And the percentage of people who vote by mail, right? Which we used to call absentee ballots, right? So you can see there's just a tectonic shift going on in the way people present themselves to vote. Okay, and to complicate matters, the rules for absentee voting, the rules for early voting are different in virtually every state. So we have a national election in the sense that over a certain period of time, we're electing a national legislature. But the rules for how those people are elected are controlled by the state governments, right? So how you get in the ballot, how you report your activities, how the voters vote, how they are registered to vote, all of that is handled on a state level. And you can see here there are 4 states with no early in-person voting. And there are states in which there is no in-person voting. It's all done by mail. Now, here's an old white guy. They all look the same, right? But this guy is very important. Very, very interesting. If you ever come across a biography of this guy, grab it. He had a fascinating life. He was part of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, part of the signing of the Constitution of the United States. He had a long political career after that. But how do you know him? Why do you know him? Right, right. Yes, Massachusetts. So we say gerrymandering. As a footnote, his name was actually Elridge Gerry. It was a hard G. But for the purposes of gerrymandering, we've turned it into a soft G. So this guy probably had no idea that he was going to be influential for so many decades. But yes, sir.
Could I ask you to go back to the 3-line chart? You do not need to go back. But is this for New Jersey or for nationwide?
That was nationwide. The 3-line chart,
Yeah.
nationwide.
But if you look at each individual state, and you can find the reason behind it, why this line going up, that line going down. The going down is there are lines going up, there must be a line going down because
Right. Well, there is. That's true. That's true. Want to go back? Sure.
Yeah. For New Jersey, it's very easy for me to understand because
Right.
nowadays it's so easy to mail.
Right. So it's the blue line that's going down.
Because the others going up.
Yes.
You keep the same.
Yes.
But that's easy to understand. The difficult to understand by state is why the green line and the brown line going up.
Because states have made it easier
Yes. Yeah.
to vote by mail,
Yeah.
and states have implemented early voting.
Right.
Right.
So that's natural.
That's natural.
But if that's the case, you can say next couple of years, next couple of elections, they will go to flat. Because the change is already there. It's not important about how the number is for each year. It's the trend important.
I agree. That's why we're showing the trend line here.
But going forward, the trend will be flat because it's changed already.
I don't know if it will be flat. It might be.
Higher, but not so.
It might not be quite as steep. Right. Yeah, that's quite possible. I understand. That's reasonable. What's important, though, or partly what's important, is that we're going to get to the question of the delegitimation of elections. And that is tied to the mail voting, vote by mail, and to the early person voting, right? Okay, so, but for the moment now, let's just go back to Mr. Gerry of Massachusetts. Mr. Gerry of Massachusetts was a fine political operator. And of course, he's credited with thinking up the scheme of redrawing congressional districts in Massachusetts to favor the people he wanted to favor, right? Drawing district lines along partisan advantage, right? Now, that turned out to be a very good idea, at least as measured by the number of people who copied that idea over 50 states and many, many decades, right? So what we have here is an example of Texas. Texas has 38 congressional seats. And what's interesting is that there is one really competitive seat in Texas in this last go round. 1 out of 38. 1. In New Jersey, there are 12 seats. How many were competitive? Were really hotly competitive? 3?
Yeah,
Which 3?
7.
Kane Malinowski?
3 and 11.
Okay, so
That was, I heard that.
mhm. But it turned out that 3 and 11 actually,
It just benefit about the,
yeah, they coasted pretty well,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
The only one that was really up in the air was the Kane Malinowski
Yeah,
race,
yeah.
right, in Western New Jersey, right? Is that Summit's in that district, right? So there was a lot of money spent in that district, and there was a lot of attention paid to it. But you think about it, that's 1 in 12, right?
Yeah.
If you live in Frank Pallone's district or Jeff Van Drew's district, you're not going to get that kind of encouragement to vote. You're not going to get that kind of exposure to political advertising. People aren't going to come knocking on your door. There's not going to be the sense of urgency provided to voters that you certainly found in this district, right? And so, in fact, turnout would be higher in this district than it would be in most other districts in New Jersey. If you look nationally, right, this is a chart that represents the competitiveness of all the seats, right? So it's basically showing you that there are 216 Republican districts running up to this race in which there was no doubt at all that the Republican candidate was going to win, 199 in which there was no doubt the Democrat was going to win. Then, of course, there's shades in the middle, and you have exactly in this estimation 20 toss-up seats. Now, how many seats is that? Is that a lot? Is that a little? Right? That is less than 5% of the seats in the House of Representatives. So you have what we call a national election. You have all 438 seats up for grabs, but really only 20 of them were considered hotly competitive, right?
Do you think they're not hotly competitive because the people like the representation they're getting, or they just vote the party line?
Because of the way the districts are drawn, and people vote the party line. That's why the lines are that way. So let me make a little aside. People vote the party line. We have this myth in America that I grew up with, and I hear it from time to time. So don't say it tonight, right? People say, I vote for the man, not for the party. That's nonsense. There's no evidence to support that. And I mean, maybe there are people out there somewhere who haven't scientifically been discovered yet who do that. But no. People vote party. End of story.
Is this what 2022?
This is 2022, yes.
So this 20, which you said below the 5%, changes every single year, every single.
No.
It's always this way.
Yeah, it's always that constrained, if that's what you're saying.
So this number, even though you said this is 2022, but this is basically constant. The 5% is basically constant.
Basically constant.
And if that I could ask, 20 including the 7 in New Jersey, because if
Yeah.
you consider,
Yeah.
if you
Yeah.
consider this 20 is 5%, and we have 50 states, so only 2.5 states get one inside.
Yeah.
And New Jersey is so lucky to get one into it.
Yeah. Although it's worse than that because the 7th district in New Jersey was a gift of the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. they made a calculation that they wanted to shore up Andy Kim, they wanted to shore up Josh Gottheimer, they wanted to shore up Mikey Sherrill,
Yeah.
and so it was a trade-off.
Yeah.
So they, they put maybe another 5,000 to 7,000 Republican voters into Malinowski's district, and they sunk him.
Malinowski had fallen out of favor. And the new district, I think, is from Elizabeth out to the Delaware.
Yeah,
It's a
Yeah.
Curious configuration.
yes,
when you go-
curious. Sounds like gerrymandering, right?
Peter, those 20 then, would that be, that basically registered Republicans and registered Democrats are about even in those toss-ups? Is that how you get to the-
Basically, that's what it comes down to. Yeah,
I don't-
because people vote on party lines. Now, it's not as simple as a 1-to-1 ratio because Republican voters have slightly different characteristics than Democratic voters. And one of them is that Republican turnout typically is higher than Democratic turnout in midterm elections. Republicans are more frequent voters in general than Democratic voters. So that makes a difference in the cycle.
But when you say this, how do you compare to the initial 37 versus 40? And you said once one party controls the White House, more likely the other party will change the House.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But what you didn't say is now compared to what you just said about the Republican has more voters to turn out. And if some party takes the White House, do you think the other party will have a higher turnout ratio than the other opposite? Let's say.
So
Democratic-
the out party
Yeah.
will often have the turnout surge.
Surge,
if-
yeah.
If that's what you're asking, yeah.
Yeah, but then that's a contradict to what you just said. Of Republican always have more voters to turn out. You just said, a couple minutes.
Yeah, well, I'm saying statistically and historically, Republican voters turn out more frequently than Democrats, and not across the board, not all the time, but that's a typical pattern. I'll say that's true in the last 30 to 40 years.
So if they control the White House, the Democratic Party will have more voters to come out to vote.
Right, but remember, I'm talking in an aggregate statistic. These races take place in very confined and defined geographical spaces. So there are other dimensions to consider. For example, the quality of the candidate. The quality of the candidate can matter a lot, right? So you look at a candidate, if it's okay to say, I'll say Mikey Sherrill, right? It's a good candidate, right?
Yeah.
For a variety of reasons. She's got military service. She's got an attractive family to show off.
George Washington Law School.
She has credentials. She's got a good organization behind her, right? Not everybody comes to the table with those kinds of credentials, right? They're low functioning candidates sometimes, right? Now, there's a debate out there, for example, and I'm not saying, I'm not coming down on one side or the other, but I am saying that there is a debate, for example, that says one of the reasons the Republicans underperformed is because they fielded a lot of candidates who were not the best quality candidates.
Yeah.
That's what Mitch McConnell basically said, right?
Yes, he did. Yeah, Mitch McConnell said it. So that's right. I'm off the hook. I can say it, right? So, yeah.
Midterm, you pick anybody to serve as president. If anything going wrong with the country, we'll pin it on that person.
Exactly,
So
right.
the tide shifts.
Right.
If you said 37 of the last 40, that takes us back to like 1942. If
Take-
I'm following numbers right?
No, it takes us back to the Civil War because that's just midterm elections. It's not presidential elections. So it takes us back to the 1870s.
Okay,
yeah.
all right.
Yeah. So yeah, it's exactly as you say. The president and his party in power take the rap for any dissatisfaction, right? and it becomes an easy campaign slogan to say that your problems are caused by whomever happens to be occupying the White House, right? And so this slide shows you the flipped congressional districts by winning party, right? So there are 26 districts that flipped out of 438, right? 26. And I'm sorry, 435. 435. I was counting, yeah, the electoral votes, but no, 435. And that's not very many, right? For all the Sturm and Drang that we just went through. And if you drill down into that, you'll see that, for example, that a lot of this is candidate driven. Some of it's party driven. You know, the Democrats lost 4 seats in New York State, which they should have lost if their congressional redrawing had been sustained by the court. But they were very aggressive with their gerrymandering, and the court threw it out. So they were stuck because they didn't have a new map. They had to run on the old map, and it cost them 4 seats.
Is the gerrymandering triggered every 10 years by the census?
Yes, the gerrymandering is triggered every 10 years by the census. That's right. So we have this causal path, right? We have old white guy from the 1700s, early 1800s, leads to fewer and fewer competitive seats, leads to the phenomenon people always refer to as polarization, right? Now, generally speaking, you know, a lot of people think about the consequences of polarization, let's say at the Thanksgiving dinner table, right? You can't have your Trumpster relatives at the same table with your Bernie Sanders supporters, right? It's just not going to work anymore, right? But there's another consequence to the polarization that's inside these districts. And that is when you are in a solid Republican district and a solid Democratic district, as an incumbent, you're not worried about your general election challenge. You're not worried about a Democrat or a Republican, somebody from the opposite party taking you down in the general election. You are worried, as Eric Cantor should have been, about a primary challenger emerging, right? So what happens in polarization is essentially in the pink district here, where we love snow, the incumbent is attacked for not loving snow enough, right? In a primary challenge. To fend off that potential primary challenge, the incumbent then has to make sure that the campaign, the messaging is always about how much he or she loves snow. You got to really emphasize it because you got to fend off that challenge from the hyper snow lovers, right? And the same thing goes over here, right? That poor polar bear is worried not about being challenged in an election by snow lovers. No, that poor polar bear is worried about being challenged in a primary election by people who claim he doesn't hate snow enough. So, to fend off that potential primary challenger, that polar bear has to make sure that his messaging, his voting record, his posturing is all about making sure that people know that he hates snow more than anybody else. He is the chief snow hater for his constituency. That's the polarization that really bites. So that gets us into the final leg here. Let's talk about this first then, sure.
The whole thing, huh?
That is the Hall of Fame. That is what's called the Freedom Caucus. So we want to talk about, and I want you to volunteer your own ideas about what is going to change as a result of the 22 midterms. And this is a collection of people who are prominent in what's called the Freedom Caucus in the House. And I don't know if you can recognize any of these characters.
Rand Paul, the upper right.
Yes, this is the younger Paul. Right. Ron was, I think, a real libertarian. Rand, I'm not sure. But Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz. Yeah, looking good. Now here's a guy you should recognize, if only because he's from New Jersey. Yes. Yeah. And an FDU alumnus.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
That is Jeff Van Drew.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Change party.
Yeah, he changed parties. That's right. And he's quite safe down there as a Republican. Now, why is that important? I'll tell you, because of that flag up in the top. These are all people who've made it clear that they are not 100% in support of Ukraine. And there are a number of them who have advocated under the banner of America First that we should not be supporting Ukraine either at all, or at least not to the extent that we are in fact doing so. They're all people who are big critics of the Atlantic Alliance. They have all come out and said to one degree or another that when appropriations bills come forward that include money for Ukraine, that they will be offering some degree of resistance. So the fact that the Republicans now have a majority in the House, of course, means that they now control all the committees, right? So because the House of Representatives is not really one body. It's a body that functions by committee work. And anything that gets done in committee or even in subcommittees. Anything that doesn't get done is getting not done in committees and subcommittees. Right? So once the Republicans have a majority of seats in the House, they have a majority of seats on every committee and every subcommittee. And when they have a majority on every subcommittee, then even a handful of people can make a big noise.
Could I ask you, when you mentioned the gerrymandering a couple minutes ago, if the election system changed to the ranking, do you think that the gerrymandering still matter or will not matter?
If we change what ranking?
The different election system, like a ranking system, like a New York City mayor.
Oh, if we went to ranked choice voting, you mean?
Yeah.
Would that make a difference?
Yeah. Because gerrymandering, you cannot change it. It's always there. But if you change the election structure system, the method, then you take away that. We're not happy.
I think it wouldn't be one answer. I think it would probably you'd still gerrymander districts, right?
Right. But it will not consider the impact. With that?
So I'm not sure what you're looking for. It wouldn't, having ranked choice voting would not get rid of gerrymandering.
Right. What I'm thinking, the gerrymandering is always there. You cannot
Yes,
change it.
you
There's
cannot
no
change
way.
it. Right.
Unless you find a perfect method to distribute evenly or whatever. But if you change the election system on the other side, will that reduce the impact of gerrymandering? Because you cannot change it.
No, you wouldn't. No, I don't. Off the cuff, I'd have to say it wouldn't change it because the gerrymandering is still trying to fix one party's dominance in each of those districts. So I would presume one party would still dominate. There are a lot of voting schemes people have tried, and my answer is always it's a trade-off. So there's no such thing as a neutral rule. All rules have consequences. And if you change the rules, you change the way people play the game, but it may not be the change that you're looking for. And I mean, that's more true in electoral rules than anything else. And that's why they're so hard to change, because there are built-in advantages for one party or the other.
I was talking to friends some years back who have been in DC and some of the temperature. And when I asked them why so much tribalism in the US, I said, think about it. Far left or far right in the past, you get in the general election voting, you have to come back towards the center. He said, no, you don't have to do that. You can stay out on the extremes.
And you have to, because, right, because of the polar bear example, right? You have to hate the snow, you have to love the snow. Your district is all a bunch of snow haters or snow lovers. And you have to make sure that you fend off the challenge from your own party.
Fascinating way to think about it.
And that's what Eric Cantor, for early example, did not do, right?
But somebody must have really put it politely, disliked
Oh, yeah.
national radio station.
Oh, Laura England disliked him. Rush Limbaugh disliked him. They beat on him. Yeah. Now, was that justified? I mean, I don't know. I'm not in a position to say. Maybe the two of them just needed, a target. Maybe they just needed to goose up their voters. Maybe they just needed to have a cause. I don't know, but they sent him packing.
So like in New Jersey, the Senate President, Steve Sweeney got bounced.
He did. That's right. That's right. One of those is Gozart. And I'm blanking on the other name. No. No. It'll come back to me. No. Oh, Paul Gozart is the bottom left, right?
Yeah, I don't know.
All right, it'll come back to me. Give me some rope there. We'll show you some interesting numbers here. 1 in 210, 3 in 24, 210 years. In the first 210 years of the Constitution, we had one impeachment trial of a president. In the last 25 years, 24 years, in my children's lifetime, we've had 3. Right? I think that you can look forward to more of that.
How many times do you consider Trump was impeached?
Twice. Yeah.
Nixon, he never was he?
He resigned. That's right. Right. And then, there were other impeachment investigations and preparations from time to time, but none of them came to anything for one reason or another, and until the last 25 years. Which again is really greatly a function of the media environment, which has exploded and fractured at the same time, and of the gerrymandering. Delegitimation, that's a thing, right? We've opened that door. And I don't think it has to be said, but I'll say it anyway, right? The peaceful transition of power from one group of elites to another group of elites, usually defined by political parties, is what distinguishes a democracy from failed states, from failed democracies, from autocracies, from everybody else. And once you don't have that, well, then you don't have.
But my sense is that it comes from this feeling that the election was not fair. Actually, half the country thinking the election was not done fairly.
Well, you don't have half the country, but you have most of the people in one political party who believe that.
But it happens in every election. In 2016, 16 was the same thing.
No, I don't think it was the same thing at all. Although I understand, and I've heard
Yeah.
many Republican partisans say that it's the same thing. I don't have any recollection anyway, and I haven't seen any evidence that there were Democrats calling for a redo of the election in 2016. No Democrats were calling for state legislatures to intervene and overturn the certified popular vote in their state.
They wouldn't certify the election in December when they met. They would not, they were voting against.
There were a
certifying.
handful of Democratic,
There was?
yeah,
Oh.
it was not a party-wide movement. And that they were people on the fringe, and the leadership put them down. So this is you can say there is some sort of echo or similarity, but it's not on the same scale at all.
2020 was like 46 or something, didn't it?
Members of the House.
In the House.
Yes, it was quite a lot.
More than, I think it was less than 10 or something.
Yeah. That's an enormous difference. And it's not limited to those members of the House, right? I mean, you can look at poll after poll, which asks people this question, right? So you can see that, for example, a majority of Republicans think that the events of January 6th a year ago were legitimate, peaceful protest, right?
No, the difference is how long it lasts. Even today, you're talking about 2 years ago, the election was stolen. But the 16, it may be just a couple months, maybe, right?
Yeah, another big difference was in 2016, the losing candidate conceded.
Okay, yeah. That's a big difference.
In 2016, the winning candidate, before the election was even held, said that he might not accept the election results.
Right. Yeah, he did it, yeah.
That is a major change in the culture of American politics. And that same person, by the way, a couple of days ago, suggested that the Constitution, or at least parts of it, be suspended. Now, look, where I come from, people like that were considered, beyond the pale. So all I'm saying now is that represents a huge change in what's acceptable in the American political culture.
Remember the year that Gore and Bush, the hanging chart? It was so close. And the hanging chart, remember?
So now, a lot of the candidates who went into this election saying that they did not think the result of the 2020 election was legitimate, and that they thought the state legislatures should take control of the certification of presidential electors and that sort of thing. A lot of them, most of them actually lost. So that will delay, but I'm here to say will not put an end to this. Once you open the door to delegitimization, it's hard to close, maybe impossible.
I would think that there's probably some think tanks that study this. They go back to 2,000 years. And this is a technique for how fascists take over. Go back into United Citizens, what were the forces behind the scenes that were pushing all this money to get in the game. Now, I don't think the Dark Ages happened by chance in the medieval times. It's not like somebody shut the lights out. It's sort of the human condition that seeking power want more power and more money. And so they lock it in, seemingly through legitimate means, as a Supreme Court, and then they have a 20, 30, 50-year plan, and they fund it, and then what's the next thing? You delegitimize. And that opens the door to grant power. And it's probably right out of the dictator's playbook if you go back over 2,000 years.
Well, you're putting me in mind of something, an advertisement I saw many years ago, back in the days when there was something called MTV. Do you remember that? The M stood for music. and they were an innovative cable channel because all they did was play music videos all day. It was all the rage. Jerry, you probably never watched it, right? No, but that was a huge thing among America's youth. I don't know when, maybe in the 90s, right?
My kids watch it.
Yeah, okay, there you go. Your kids watched it. But they, like everybody else, put on some public service ads around one of the elections. And in this public service ad that was meant to just encourage people to go out and vote, they showed pictures of Adolf Hitler storming around and spitting and, you know, raising his arm. And then they showed old footage of Mussolini thumping his chest and shouting just as loud. Maybe they showed somebody in Japan, and then the punchline was, idiots like these are why you need to vote. That was the punchline. And my reaction then and now was, idiots like those were voted into power. They didn't come into power by coup d'etat. They were voted in. And in each case, they delegitimized the system in the eyes of the populace as part of their campaign. Right. All right. So here's another thing to look forward to, and this is special just for Jerry here, because every once in a while, I'm sure you know, you have to raise the debt ceiling. You have to raise the debt, or we say we have to raise the debt ceiling because we have to borrow more money because we spend more than we take in, right? We want low taxes, and we make up the difference with spending, right? So this chart shows the debt limit here on the blue line, or the actual U.S. federal debt as a percentage of GDP. And as you can see, that's a steady increase, right? At the bottom, of course, we show the years. And the red and the blue is meant to show you Republican presidents, Democratic presidents. And the conclusion I want you to draw is what? Yeah, it doesn't really matter, right? Republican presidents, Democratic presidents, doesn't matter, right? The debt ceiling is going to go up. It's not a Republican thing. It's not a Democratic thing by the facts of the matter, but of course it is presented as a showdown between people who claim to be fiscally responsible against the people they claim to be fiscally irresponsible. So you should have another one of these confrontations now that the House has changed hands by March, I think. And so this will be yet another topic in the news for weeks at a time. Yes, sir.
I think the last one, the COVID, is not just COVID alone. It's COVID plus the tax reduction.
Yes. Yeah. No doubt.
Huge.
Yeah. The tax reduction was huge. Yeah.
So the COVID is a natural disaster, but the tax reduction is the party's decision.
Yes.
So it's different.
Yeah, I agree. You had the Trump tax cuts at the same time that you had stimulus bills, right? That's what you're saying.
It seems like once it goes up, it doesn't go down.
Who was the last president to have a balanced budget?
Clinton, yeah.
This is meant to be cute. You want to know what's going to happen in 2024? You want to know who the Republican favorites are going to be? Keep your eye on Fox, right? Why? Because Fox has the largest cable news audience by far. By far. right? And its audience skews older.
Oh,
And those older voters are much more likely to turn out to vote and to vote more frequently than other voters. So that's a very important audience for candidates to speak to, right? And it's also a very important audience for the people who editorialize at Fox to speak to. Right? And then Fox is owned by the same person who owns the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, any number of other outlets in the United States and in other countries. It's owned, ironically, by a first-generation immigrant, right? And it has an enormous sway over what people think, right? Huge audiences, supplemented by major syndicated radio programs and, of course, by websites that have niche audiences. Of course, now you have One America, which is a new cable station that's trying to be a little more America first than Fox. Have you watched One America? Have you seen that?
yeah, it's gone now.
It's gone.
Yeah.
What?
Well, you cannot see it, and because
Already?
AT&T does not pay it
Oh.
because
Oh, it's gone from your cable network.
I use Verizon. In the past, you can find it, but now it's gone.
It's out of your package,
right.
Yeah.
It's Verizon.
but they haven't gone out of business.
Oh, they're still there.
I think they're still there. Does anyone know?
I was told that AT&T.
Okay.
What's the name of it? What's the name?
With America.
One America, right?
Yeah. Huh?
Yeah. Yeah.
Trying to get to the right of Fox.
Yeah, exactly. So here's the top cable news programs. I'm not a big watcher of TV, but I can tell you that the top 3 in this 10 are all on Fox. Right? That's a lot of influence for their editorialists. So 34 should be familiar because it's 1/3 of 100. That's the number of Senate seats that will be up in 2024. 23 is the number of
Democrat.
seats the Democrats hold that they're going to have to defend. And I would say of the remaining 11, which are Republican held, most of those 11, maybe 9 out of those 11 are pretty safe Republican Senate seats. Of the 24 Democratic Senate seats, many of those are going to be competitive. So I think that the Democrats are feeling good right now, but they got a tough Senate cycle coming up very soon. And when I say soon, I mean the election for 2024 started the day after the midterm election, right?
What's percentage for Bob Menendez and his son?
I beg your pardon?
Bob Menendez percentage, his son, what Hoboken.
Oh,
Yeah, what happened? Did he get elected?
Of course he got elected. Yes. Yeah.
His Hoboken by a landslide.
Well, right. So Menendez's son's seat, that district is overwhelmingly Democratic. So if you win the Democratic nomination, you will win the seat. There's no doubt about it. And there are quite a few districts like that, right? They're going to be 70% Democratic vote in one every 2 years. Same is true for Donald Payne's district, right, in Newark.
4 years ago, Menendez's competitor was another blonde. I forget the guy's last name. He was LSLG.
Yeah.
He was a Marine. He was a Princeton graduate.
And
He lost.
right.
Mayor of Jersey City? John
Is it
Lawrence?
No, that's a different guy.
No?
Is that Summit?
What's that?
Hugan.
Hugan.
Resident of Summit. Here.
He could have been.
Yeah, I know where he lives.
He was a CEO of Celtic.
Yes.
Yeah.
Works here.
And he put something like $50 million into that race of his own money.
Chairman of the Republican Party of the state of New Jersey.
Yeah. So he's a high quality candidate,
Yeah.
is what you want to say, right?
Yeah.
And I think he did about as well as you can do in a statewide Senate race in New Jersey.
And Hugo and Menendez were classmates back in Union City. So-
Yeah, that's right. They were the same church or the same school or something. Okay.
Yeah. So your question is, why did Menendez win?
Yeah. Well, with the numbers, you explained it to me tonight.
Yeah.
But from a character perspective, the guy's accused of all kinds of corruption.
Okay, let's take it out of New Jersey, right? Right. So first of all, that brings us back to, do people vote for the man or the party, right? When they're voting for Bob Menendez, there's no doubt he has an inner circle, maybe a wider circle that like him, who respond to his constituent work, who have met him, who are his supporters. But the mass of voters are voting for him because he's the Democratic candidate. Right? And they know when he goes to the Senate, he's going to vote with the Democratic caucus. Right? Just as they know when if Bob Hugan were have to won that race, and if he had gone to Washington, he would have voted for the Republican caucus. He can say until he's blue in the face, I'm a moderate or I'm a reasonable man. But once you get into the Senate, you have to choose which caucus you're going to be in, right? He's going to be in the Republican caucus, and to play ball to get anything done, you're going to have to work on committees
Get appropriations.
to get anything at all, right? Which means you have to work with your own party members, and they expect you to vote with them.
So that brings the question as if US should have the third party. Two-party system?
No, it doesn't.
No?
No. Well, that's a good question, though. But to be fair, let's come back to that in a moment, okay? Prim is asking about a third-party solution,
Yeah.
right? All right. But let's look at character in a different context. Taking it out of New Jersey, let's go to, I don't know, Georgia,
Yeah.
Right?
Today.
right?
Today's.
Is there a candidate in that race who seems to be of poor character?
Right. Yes.
And is that candidate hotly competitive for the open seat, despite being a man of questionable reputation? Yeah.
Yeah.
And why? Why?
Party line.
Yeah.
Because if Herschel Walker goes to the United States Senate, they're all assuming he will vote with the Republican caucus.
Yeah.
So the rest is not relevant.
Peter, out of curiosity, why do elections come down so close, 49 to 55%?
Yeah. Always.
You look at it, even in Summit.
Yeah.
It's just, it seems like the country and a lot of states are almost evenly divided.
Right.
What drives that phenomenon?
I'm going to have to disagree. I think that the ones we look at closely are the hot races. Those are the ones put before us because they're that close. Most of the races are not close, and most of them are not being put before us, and we're not thinking about them. Yeah.
So that's where the news media gets you to turn in more. They got a hot race, right? Challenging. What's going to happen?
Well, they know you're not going to sit down in front of the TV and watch a long story about the lopsided race, let's say, in Hudson County, New Jersey, right? There's just not much to report there. They would conclude it. We're not going to keep eyeballs on the screen, right? What people want to know is what's happened, what's developing in that other race, which is hotly contested. Sure.
Like a good fight. Yeah.
Right. So third party, right? There are at least two people I can think of who agree with you, Prim, and they are Christy Whitman and Andrew Yang,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
What's their chances of success?
Forward party very low. Very low.
Zero. Let's just round it down to zero.
Okay.
Yeah. Not happening. Yeah.
But is this a good solution for the US, who knows, in the future?
Yeah, no.
No.
So, well, we don't have a multi-party system because the rules don't provide for it. If you have a system of proportional representation,
Right.
like you do, let's say, in Germany,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
it's a mixed system,
Yeah.
you will have multiple parties because the incentives are for small parties or for parties to splinter,
Yeah.
right? Israel is actually much better example, right? But when you have what we have, which is single member, single districts, and winner take all rules,
Yes, yes,
the incentive is to aggregate.
yeah,
You will have fewer parties, but you will have more factions within the party.
yeah, yes, yes.
So there is in political science talk, we say there's an inverse ratio between the number of parties
Yeah.
and the number of factions.
Yes,